Sean, how you doing today?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Thank you for joining us in this today. I'm really excited. I think I told you a little bit about how we ended up discovering Karen Gonzalez, but I guess it was about 4 months ago when we were thinking about Cabin Fever Church. We started looking at our resource list for blocks, and we noticed that there were some authors that were potential interviewees, I suppose. And one of them was Karen Gonzalez. And come to find out that more recently, we've had one of Karen's friends start hanging out here at Watershed. And so right about the time I was getting ready to reach out to Karen to see if she would be willing to spend some time with us, her friend Courtney literally texted me the same week and said, I don't know if you've heard of Karen Gonzalez, but you really need to reach out to her. And my response was, you're not going to believe this, but that's exactly who I was getting ready to talk to this week. And so, Courtney, if you're watching this morning, thank you for greasing those wheels, because a text or two later, and the next thing I know, I'm literally talking to Karen via text. So it was just a great exchange. What excites you this morning about this conversation, Sean?
Well, I was really excited to be invited to this conversation. I think for me as a Latina, representation is very exciting. To have another brown body speak into this sort of experience of what it means to be in the world during this crazy time. But also I'm really excited about her work on immigration and her voice there. I was able to get into some of her book, and she's just really wise, and I'm excited that we get to tap into that this morning.
So the book that she has written is called The God Who Sees: Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong. If you go to our Watershed webpage and then you click on community and then you click on blocks, there's actually a resource link that leads you to her book, or you can just go to Amazon and search it. But let's get her in here and let's see what she has to say. This is going to be fun.
I'm excited.
Hey, Karen, thanks for joining us this morning. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for jumping in here with Sean and myself. I think probably the last time that we had a chance to talk, I gave you a little bit of context in terms of who we are as a community. Mm-hmm. I think we talked about how, especially over the last 3 years, Watershed has been trying to understand itself, embody, trying to understand and embody, maybe even incarnate justice, liberation, more as a way of being, not just within ourselves, but within the world, and here, certainly here in Charlotte. And I know you're going to take us to some places that, quite frankly, I'm not sure we've explored here within our community. I know we haven't explored them to the extent that we want to, but before we kind of dive into some things, could you just take a moment and kind of tell us a little bit about yourself? We've been typically asking this question of our guests. Who are you and who are you to yourself? And so who is Karen Gonzalez to Karen Gonzalez?
Sure. So I think there's a lot you can learn about me just from reading my bio or website, that I write, I speak, I advocate for immigrants, that I'm an immigrant myself from Guatemala. And I think one of the most important things to know about me is I am someone who learned early on that one of the easiest ways to be in America is to assimilate to white culture. And I learned to do that really well. And that was really my MO for a lot of my life. And then during seminary and post-seminary, I think what I have come to understand is there's really certain paths you can take as an immigrant. You can do the assimilation path. You can do the remaining in my pocket culture path. So in Little Havana, right, you can remain there, or you can live in LA, in East LA. And I think there's a third way that's harder, and that's what I'm trying to embrace and step into, and that's the integration without assimilation of being connected to my ethnic identity and not abandoning my roots, And also understanding that I have this privilege of being able to navigate white culture really well. And it positions me to advocate for my own community well. And I think that is probably, to me, that's who I deal with the most or struggle with the most, are those conflicting identities.
So we've got a list of questions here that, we're in theory going to throw your way, but I want to also give us all permission to go way off script, because you said something and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm dying to know this. When you started this journey, words like assimilation and waking up to the very idea of assimilation, there had to be some sort of an event or story. Like, how did that start to happen for you, that you recognized there was something going on and that you had a choice in the matter moving forward?
Sure. So it actually started when I was a teacher. I used to be a high school English teacher in a suburb of Tampa. And I started reading a poem with my students by a Puerto Rican poet and writer, educator, Martin Espada, and it's called Tony Went to the Bodega, but he didn't buy anything. And it's a poem about a young man who grows up in an ethnic enclave in Long Island. Mm-hmm. And quickly he learns about success, and he leaves his home to go to law school in Boston, and he just greatly misses his culture. So he goes and he hangs out in bodegas, which are like ethnic convenience stores here in the Northeast. He hangs out there, not because he needs to buy anything, but because he misses his people, because the bodega provides for him a sense of belonging and familiarity. And to me, what's most beautiful is that the poem ends and says that today Tony, is a lawyer and he lives above the bodega. So he never had to completely disconnect. He could embrace who he was and not become alienated, which I feel happens to a lot of us immigrants. We feel pressured to that eventually we assimilate, not understanding how costly that is to give up parts of ourselves that are so integral to who we are and that are so connected to our families and our ancestors. And so actually, I read that poem with my students, and I am not a crier. And I read it with them, and I just started crying. I just realized just what a beautiful story of success it was. Very contrary to the success story that was sold to me, but I realized that's what I want. I want that sense of belonging that Tony has, hanging out in the bodega, being a success, but living in his community.
Tony went to the bodega, but he didn't buy anything. Tony's father left the family and the Long Island city projects, leaving a mongrel skinny Puerto Riqueño boy, 9 years old, who had to find work. Makengo the Cuban let him work at the bodega. In grocery aisles, he learned the steps of the dry mop mambo, banging the cash register like a piano percussion in the spotlight of Machito's orchestra, polite with the abuelas who bought on credit, practicing the grin on customers he'd seen Makengo grin with his bad yellow teeth. Tony left the projects too with a scholarship for law school, but he cursed the cold primavera in Boston. The cooking of his neighbors left no smell in the hallway, and no one spoke Spanish, not even the radio. So Tony walked without a map through the city, a landscape of hostile condominiums and the darkness of white faces, sidewalk searcher lost till he discovered the projects. Tony went to the bodega, but he didn't buy anything. He sat by the doorway satisfied to watch la gente, people island brown as him, crowd in and out, hablando español, thought, this is beautiful, and grinned his bodega grin. This is a rice and beans success story. Today, Tony lives on Tremont Street, above the bodega.
I feel like what you're describing is, so my father is American, my mother is from Costa Rica, I was born there. So like everything is lighting up inside because so much of that resonates, that notion of assimilation. And I think what I hear in what you describe is this beautiful Gloria Anzaldúa mestiza consciousness concept, right? That to embrace all of our borderlands, to embrace all of the things that make us us, and to be unapologetic about that. I think I've had to learn a lot of what it means to decolonize myself, and to embrace all of those facets of my own sort of cultural heritage. And Martina Espada, that poem is, we'll have to link it because it's a beautiful poem of, I think, what it means to be successful in that mestiza consciousness, sort of awakened space.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So the title of your book is The God Who Sees, Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed in some of what you wrote in that piece, you and I talked about this as well. You talk a little bit about the journey that you just described, but then also you talk about displacement. And at Watershed, we've had this ongoing conversation for the past couple of years, and again, we feel like we're just starting to get our heads wrapped around the idea of intersectionality and power dynamics. But when you and I were together the last time, you spoke about the intersectionality of displacement, and then you just like went off for like 20 minutes, and I'm like, I couldn't type enough to kind of try to capture everything that you said, and rather than me just try to regurgitate it, maybe you could just return to that idea. And maybe either revisit it or say a little bit more about the idea of intersectionality and displacement.
I think it's very complicated with immigration because, like, I live in a community in Baltimore, Maryland, where there are a lot of refugees resettled, particularly from the Congo. And so they live at this intersection of being immigrants, of being Black, of being non-English language speakers, so speaking English with a heavy accent. And all of these things are part of their identity. And when people see them on the street, they just see them as an African-American, right? People don't think of them as like, oh, this is a Congolese immigrant. And so I think for many of us, there's a lot of intersections, like I'm a woman and I'm a Latina, I'm a Guatemalteca, I'm single. And in the church, all those identities can really marginalize you. But also I'm documented and have been for a long time. I'm a naturalized citizen, I'm educated. So those are privileges, right, that not everyone has. And so I think in immigration, there's a sort of layered conversation because people can experience a layered systemic oppression that often isn't seen or acknowledged by people. So one of the most important theologians in Latina theology is Ana Maria Isasi Diaz, who wrote a book called Mujerista Theology, where she talks about how we as Latinas are often seen as not protagonists in the story, but as sort of supporting actresses to someone else's story. And you can see that in the way we're often portrayed in media as nannies, as housekeepers, right? As not people who have a leading story. And so her claim was, no, we need to reclaim that we are protagonists of our stories. So one of the things that I wrote about in the book was the story of Hagar, from which I took the title of The God Who Sees. And Hagar is a young woman. She's young, she's foreign, she's dark-skinned, many theologians believe, and she's an enslaved person. We talk about layers of oppression in her story. Someone who in the ancient world would have been invisible, and yet God sees her. She's not invisible to God. And not only does God see her, she gets to give God a name, something no one else in the Bible does. She's the first and the only. And God appears to her twice through a messenger and appears to her in an identical way to the way that God appears to Mary in the Gospel of Luke. And it's a really fascinating parallel that we often don't talk about. And what it brings to mind for me is just like the Protagonista story. Are we making the heroes of the story people who perhaps weren't meant to be the heroes? Is maybe Hagar supposed to be a hero of the story, but we don't have eyes to see that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but feel free to interject.
I mean, I think that's brilliant. We've talked about Hagar before, and I just love this notion of reframing stories or disrupting a narrative that has existed for so long that may not be the right narrative, right? I think we're seeing a lot of that happen now with the Black Lives Matter movement, disrupting these horrible untruths, disrupting these stereotypes, disrupting these single stories that don't allow for multiplicity of character. And so to hear you cast a new, I think is really great for our community to hear. So I'm excited.
The thing that was running through my mind in all of this is when you start using language of decolonization, and you're naming all the different ways that you can understand yourself, all of the intersecting parts of yourself. I don't think I'm positive, my whiteness never called me to notice variations of anyone, including myself. And so like there's something that I think that I've experienced over the last 3 years where I'm realizing everything that I just sort of was on autopilot, assuming about what it meant to be me. All of a sudden, there's this pulling back of the veil to say, this thing, this white supremacy that has been the bass note underneath everything for so long, certainly it robs a person of color, and it robs me of something. It has me assuming that I am whatever it is the world has told me that I am, and that I need to align towards that. And so when I hear you describing your experiences, either one of you, and then even the story you told, I start to get moved, and I think it's because I'm recognizing there's a whole universe of creativity and beauty that it is true, that it exists, and that's more of just a thank you than it is anything. I don't know if there's a question in there per se, but feel free to riff on anything I said there.
Well, I think another interesting, so you also talk about Ruth in your book, and I think if you mention in the book, if Ruth were alive today, that immigration story of hers probably wouldn't come to bear in the same way, right? That particular book is a model of how we ought to treat the stranger. And I'm curious if you want to talk about, particularly in your line of work, why do you think we've gone so astray from that biblical imperative of caring for the stranger, of caring for the neighbor? Maybe influenced by your theology, but maybe also, I think, tell us a little bit about what it is that you do every day.
Sure. So to answer sort of the first part of that question, I read a book you probably have heard of called Tattoos on the Heart by Father Greg Boyle. And in this book, he talks a lot about kinship. And in kinship, it really reminds me of, there's a Mayan saying, eres mi otro yo, which means you are my other self. And really translated is you are me and I am you. So we are each other. And I think we've lost a sense of that in the church, in our country specifically. I mean, you can see it today just with the way people refuse to wear masks to serve their neighbors. It's all about me and my family, not a sense of like, no, my neighbor belongs to me. My neighbor is me. And so I think where we lose that. We lose a little bit of our own humanity in that when we dehumanize the neighbor. But I hear it in the way our president talks, in the way that many people who reject immigrants, who want us to close borders, which effectively they're closed right now, will talk about immigrants as animals, infestation. Even people who are pro-immigration don't use humanizing language. They talk about aliens, stranger, which is a biblical term, but certainly wasn't a slogan in the ancient world. And so when you remove the person from your language and you stop seeing yourself and the neighbor, I think that creates a real us versus them rather than we together. And I think that is a large part of it in the US. And I think as people experience economic peril, globalization has eliminated a lot of jobs. A lot of jobs have gone overseas. Even I was recently, before COVID, I was in Ciudad Juarez and El Paso and saw how many just factories are just over the border there in Juarez. And I think it's natural to want to find someone to blame for our economic situation, for loss of opportunities. Think about all the people who used to work in car manufacturing, all the people who used to work in mining, all the people whose jobs have become automated or sent overseas and don't have the opportunities they used to have. They want to find someone to blame. And our politicians are very good at blaming immigrants, usually, for that. It's an old story that existed even in the Old Testament. What I find most telling is that in the Old Testament, God says to God's people, you must love the immigrant as yourself, for you were immigrants. God reminds them, this is you. What does Jesus do in Matthew 25? He doesn't say, you should care for immigrants. He says, I was an immigrant and you welcome me. He takes on that very persona, right? He says, I am this. I am the prisoner. I am the immigrant. I am the one who's poor and naked. And some of it is just, I think, a failure of discipleship. And some of it is just our own individualistic culture that doesn't really want to see the other as self. So in my work, to answer the second question, so I work for World Relief, which is an organization based here in Baltimore. And we actually have several offices in North Carolina. And we work in the US in refugee resettlement, immigration legal services, and providing services to foreign-born survivors of human trafficking. So all our work in the US is with the foreign-born. And when Donald Trump took office in January of 2017, we had 25 offices. We are now down to 15 offices. And this is not just us, but it's every organization that works with the foreign-born has taken a severe hit and loss of funding, and really just there are no people to resettle. If we had all the private funding in the world, people are simply not being let into the country. So in my work with World Relief, I began in church mobilization, which is going to churches to do basically grassroots advocacy, helping congregations to see the biblical command to welcome immigrants, despite our own economic anxieties, despite our own fears around national security. This is what God calls us to. And in that, I began to see, the evangelical church gets a bad rap in this, and rightly so. I'm not saying it's not a well-earned reputation, but what I began to see, because in Baltimore, there's so many mainline denominational churches, that the congregations were basically the same. The pastors were a little more progressive because many of their denominations have very strong social teaching around immigration, but the congregants were the same as the ones in evangelical churches. Largely uninformed, didn't know the Bible said anything about immigration, hadn't really heard any preaching or teaching on that. And for me, that was really a wake-up call to realizing, wow, it's almost like this isn't even in the Bible because nobody really talks about it. I'd heard a few sermons in my life about Ruth. All of them had been around love and loyalty. I'd heard a couple of wedding ceremonies, like wedding homilies, which is odd, I think, considering that it's a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. But I never heard Ruth is an immigrant, and to be honest, I learned that from Jewish rabbis. I just started reading a lot of Jewish scholarship on the Hebrew Bible, and that's when I encountered that for many Jewish scholars, Ruth's story is a story of immigration. And so it also, I think for me, gave me this awareness that for some reason, like immigrants, we're not writing our own stories. And I don't know why that is. I've known lots of people who pitch them to publishers, but everything that I encountered was written by people who are white, and who love immigrants, who have journeyed along, with immigrants. But I think there's a space to tell our own stories as well. There's something about having personally experienced displacement. I was talking in Toronto last year at a conference with a Native American preacher and scholar, and he was telling me, Native Americans were the first people displaced on this continent. Wow, something I had never heard before. And hearing it from him, because of his own community's, personal experience, was just very, very different. And so I believe it's important for us to be in this conversation, to be writing and speaking. And in fact, there's lots of advocacy being done by immigrants. But it doesn't get the attention that it gets when, white people do this work. So.
Yeah, I think it's so important that we tell our own stories. And I think about, I write under a pen name because Sean Bowers is like a white man's name. And I had to change my name to a pen name. And the first thing that I submitted out as a poeta with the name Anita Candillo got picked up for publication. And I look now, in that landscape of scholarship, and there's many more journals that are now taking or just elevating Latinx voices that didn't exist 5-10 years ago. And so I hope that forward train keeps moving, and that we are allowed the space to tell our own stories, because I think, that's so vitally important to part of this work, really, to the anti-racist work, is to let Indigenous voices tell their own stories, to let Black people tell their own stories, to let Brown people tell their own stories. So I'm so excited that your book exists in the world for that reason, Karen.
Thank you.
We have a teaching pastor here by the name of Cedric Lundy, and one of his, I guess, one of the banners that he's constantly waving is around the idea of a common memory, and how the memory of this nation has been robbed by whiteness. And what I love about storytelling is that it starts to retell history, and it creates a narrative where you see more than you've seen in the past. And I think in some ways that's part of what has been happening for our community. We sort of self-describe as a community that's awakening, struggling, and loving together as though a different world is possible today. And we're having these harsh awakenings, and we're trying to struggle forward for a community maybe like Watershed that's predominantly white, for sure. But what does allyship look like? What does co-conspiratorship look like? What are some tangible ways that places like Watershed, or people that call this place home, could show up in a conversation like this, or show up in some of the work that you do? Are there ways to be tangibly involved in some of what it means to help the traction of the work that you're doing yourself?
Yeah, sure. I think that there is room for all of us, and I just think it's how we engage that is very important, like how we do that. And I think one of the first things that we can do is really decolonize our bookshelves. You probably heard that term before. it's a really important thing. You know, I realized I lived overseas for a few years. I lived in Russia and Kazakhstan, and I came back and was unpacking all these books, and I'm like, I'm a Latina woman, and all my books are like John Piper and Richard Foster and Tim Keller, and you know, all these, nothing, well, yeah, there is something wrong with some of those people. Would not read them anymore now, some of them, but I just realized this is so strange that I don't have people that look like me. And I just assumed, well, we must not do theology, I guess, because I would have heard about it in church, right? And what I quickly realized, again, once I was in seminary, was like, oh no, we actually have been doing theology. It's just that our books aren't getting read, that it's still, you know, predominantly white pastors read other white male writers, and this is the theology then that keeps getting passed on. And I'm not saying that we should not listen to any white men. You know, I don't think, all of us are created in the image of God, and all of us have a contribution to make. But I think we can certainly add other voices to speak in. And so that's one of the most important things that you can do. And it's hard, especially in the beginning. You start to read and you're just challenged, and I've never heard this before, it can't be right. And it's okay. It's okay to sit in the discomfort of that, even if you don't accept all of it. I don't accept all of anything I read. It's all right. It's still good to hear how other people see the scriptures, because ultimately we don't see things the way they are. We see things from who we are, who we are as people. And so that is really critical. That's the first thing. But I think the second thing is often we engage work with marginalized communities from a top-down approach of, what can I do for you? It's me, I'm here, and you're down there. And often people don't have a chance to even speak into programming or services that are for them, because decisions are just made for them. Marginalized communities are seen as having less in every single way, instead of just in the sense of, like, for example, refugee communities are seen as having less in every way because they're refugees. And so, yes, they may be struggling with English, and yes, it might be that they're new to this country and cross-cultural adjustment is difficult, but there's a lot of resilience in those communities. And often what I hear from people is like, oh, you know, working with refugees, it makes me so grateful for everything that I have, for all my stuff in my house. And that's not why immigrants exist, just for you to be grateful for your stuff. They're people created in God's image like you. So that means they have gifts and contributions to make. And when I was a church mobilizer, I was visiting this church in Baltimore, and it was all Liberians. It was a mainline church that was dying. There were like 3 elderly people left, and the church was really going to close. And this community resettled in the neighborhood. And because they were Christians, they went to the nearest church, which was that one. And they have completely brought that church back to life. It is a vibrant community now. And when I went there, I saw something really powerful. It's the sense of belonging and community that they have. You know, they don't struggle to find babysitters because they serve each other in that way. Without charge. If someone's car breaks down, well, someone's a mechanic and someone else can do carpentry or can lay tile work. And there's a real sense of community that they have of, you know, when I hear about the loneliness of American culture, I think about that community and how they're not experiencing that, how they're just very united in spirit. And so I think it's one of the ways that language harms here, because when we think about refugees, we just think about, you know, fleeing people on a boat. My friend Sandy likes to say refugee people, just to put the people back, you know, in that. And so, yeah, so I think that that's an important thing as well, is to make sure that people are part of the conversation, that they have agency, that they have choice, and then respecting their decisions and their dignity. One thing that comes up a lot in working with immigrants is, people who volunteer with us will say things like, oh, they bought a TV and that's just such, they're poor. And why would you buy a TV? Why would you waste money on something like that? And the thing is, I have a TV. Why did I waste money on that? You probably have TVs too, because it's just sometimes nice to sit down and, veg out to a Netflix binge for all of us, whether we're immigrants or not. And so why are we trying to make decisions for people about how they should use their money, or about whether or not they should get a pet, or any number of choices? There's just a lot of paternalism involved. And so coming back to what Father Greg Boyle says, burnout exists because kinship doesn't, because we don't establish relationships in mutuality. And in kinship, instead, is us doing for them. Sooner or later, that becomes exhausting. That becomes just work instead of relationship.
That's so good, because I think I've had a lot of white friends, and then a lot of folks from the watershed community, I think, who are getting a taste of what it means to be in the trenches daily. And what I'm seeing now are expressions of that very thing that you're talking about, exhaustion. And I wonder, in absence of kinship, what are some ways to kind of keep fighting that good fight, or what are some ways to sustain those levels of resistance when you find yourself sort of, I think COVID has also added this whole other dimension of things that would normally be self-care, maybe we can't reach out to, right? Our gyms are closed and we can't go out to dinner with a good friend and whatever it may be. So can you leave us with any words of wisdom on how to kind of sustain that marathon?
Yeah. Well, I think, and I learned this all the time from refugees and immigrants, is really community is really essential. There's no such thing as self-made Christians or, self-made activists or justice workers. Like, we need the support of community. And right now that's limited to things like Zoom and things like FaceTime. And however we can get that, we need to have it in our lives, because that's a fast way to exhaustion. But also, I think it's important to connect with our bodies. One thing that I realized in just really reconnecting to a lot of Latinx spiritual expressions and healing practices is a lot of it come back to connecting with your body and understanding what your body feels. And this is one of the reasons, I know, Matt, you had mentioned, I talk about the labyrinth, the practice of walking a labyrinth. And it's one of the reasons I love it, because when you're outside in the humidity right now, walking a labyrinth, it's very difficult to be disembodied. You're aware of the sweat, you're aware of the heat, you're walking, right? And not completely sure of when it's going to end, because it just depends on how fast you're walking and you've forgotten, how the path goes. And I think being disembodied can be just very harmful, because it causes us to not pay attention to when our bodies start to experience things like exhaustion, things like burnout, and then, I think when you start to experience that, that's the time to start asking questions about, why am I doing this? Why am I feeling this way? What's happening? Jesus says it's more blessed to give than to receive, right? So why is it not a blessing to me to be giving of myself right now? It could be that my relationships aren't mutual, because if a relationship is mutual, you are receiving and you are giving. But if you're giving, you become like this glass, becoming emptier and emptier, right? Instead of being refilled. So that for me is a way to sort of connect with that. And honestly, I think part of what encourages me and keeps me strong is people like you, just knowing that there are people who deeply care about issues of justice, not just around immigration, but around, all the injustices that humans can experience. To me, people like you are embodied hope and encouragement. And so I try to remember and focus on that. I regularly get little notes through my website from people who are like, I read your book. And, it's just very sweet, encouraging notes. And I'm like, wow, it's so easy to feel alone in the work or in the world. And but there are so many reminders that we're not in this alone.
Mm-hmm. What would you say? I think we've addressed a lot of what it means to be a co-conspirator and what allyship looks like, and reframing our biblical understanding from a different lens that's not white. So maybe what would you say, given the Black Lives Matter movement, given that we still have children in cages at our borders, like what words would you say maybe to the hermanas and hermanos? There's not very many of us, but we're growing at this community. What would you say to us to kind of help us keep going?
I don't know. I don't know that I would say anything specifically, but I would remind you of the story of Emmaus, where the disciples are shattered, utterly disappointed, dejected, leaving Jerusalem because they had hoped Jesus was the one, and they think he's dead. He's gone. And in this state of utter discouragement, of shattering, Jesus is with them. They don't recognize him, but he's with them the whole time. They only recognize him when they break bread together and have a meal together. And so I think that's my encouragement. It's just that Jesus is with us. Jesus, just like Jesus is at those detention centers at the border, and Jesus is in prisons, and Jesus is amid protesters and amid people who are being harmed by the police. Like, Jesus is with us, even in the points where we feel are the lowest. And then there's a return, that the road to Emmaus, this ambiguous, uncomfortable, awful place, is not the end of the story, that there's a restoration that comes.
Karen, muchísimas gracias for being with us this morning. I can't express my gratitude enough for your presence and for your energy and the sacrifice of your time. Thank you.
Yeah, I echo that too. And where can people follow you? What are some places that you could send people to? I know you have a website. What's the official website location?
Sure. So I have a website, Karen-Gonzalez.com. And I'm also on Twitter and Instagram @_ Karen J. Gonzalez. Those are probably the best places to find me. And yeah, I'd love to connect with you all.
Well, Sean, you heard that, right? We have that. We have it recorded.
Yes.
Karen, thank you so much. Be safe, be well, and have a great week.
You too.
Thanks.